What's up, you sweaty nerds and greasy degenerates? Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae comes out in less than 2 days. And if you're on the Asian server, he comes out in less than 1 day. So I thought it would be good to have a last minute refresher, a little bit of a last minute discussion about the character, how he's going to affect the game, and a little bit of a last minute warning, if you will, about the character, because he's not going to be a typical DPS character in this game. So let's go ahead and jump into it, because there's a little bit to unpack with the character, but it won't take too long. This is going to be a short video, so let's get into it. Alright, so as you can see here, we only have 1 day, 16 hours before Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae arrives in the game. But just be aware that when a new patch comes out, there's usually a maintenance, so it's probably not going to be 1 day, 16 hours. It's probably going to be like 1 day, 20 hours, 1 day, 21 hours, something like that. So just be aware of that, and if you are on the fence about Dan Heng, don't forget that Kafka is an amazing character and her banner is super hype. Likely you'll be able to pull everything you need for her entire team just by pulling her. But anyways, moving forward, Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae is a character that wants a lot of skill points, okay? He really is skill point hungry, more so than other characters. The only other character that is as skill point hungry as him is probably Kinkyu, to be perfectly honest with you. And everybody that plays Kinkyu or knows how Kinkyu plays, they understand that she's incredibly skill point hungry. She's one of the most selfish, if not the most selfish, DPS in the whole game. But I'm showing you guys this particular setup right here to show you a general idea of how you might want to run a Dan Heng team if you are pulling for him. Just be aware this Dan Heng on the right is obviously normal Dan. So just imagine this is an imaginary unit with the Imbibitor Lunae, you know. Just imagine this is Imbibitor Lunae, okay? Give me a break. So because he's so skill point hungry, to use his enhanced basic attack 3, you need 3 skill points available or several of his own stacks that he builds from his ultimate. So let's just go ahead and do like a little bit of a pretend combat scenario and how the rotation would work. I do highly recommend that you build your Dan Heng for speed, but I also recommend you build the entire team for speed. So if you have Dan Heng at 134 speed, he'll be able to go 2 turns every rotation. Every other cycle, he'll get to have more turns in a battle than he would otherwise. So you build him for like 134 speed. Then you build like Ting Yun for 135, Yukong for like 136, and like Natasha for 137. This is just an example. You don't have to build it exactly like this. I'm just showing you an example here. But if you do that, you'll have Natasha going first. She'll gain a skill point because she'll just use her basic attack. Then Yukong on turn 1 might use her basic attack as well. Ting Yun uses her skill. She buffs Dan. Maybe by this point, Dan has like 2 skill points available. Maybe he uses an enhanced basic or maybe not. Probably uses it, but will he use it for 1, 2, or 3 stacks of his ability? That's really up to you. But Ting Yun's buff will last for 3 turns. So then she's going to end up turning skill point positive after this because she won't have to use her skill for 3 turns, right? So now you've actually, by this time, you've gained 2 skill points and only used 1. So you're still staying skill point positive. Then Dan Heng has his turn. Then it goes back to Natasha. If she heals, she needs to heal, whatever. If not, basic attack. And then now, Yukong's probably going to want to use her buff. Her buff is going to buff the whole team. It's only going to last for 2 attacks though. But that's okay, because she'll buff, and then Ting Yun will use her basic attack, gaining a skill point back, and Dan Heng will use his enhanced basic attack 3 by this point, more than likely, and she'll have a buff on her attack because of Yukong, and then Dan Heng will have an attack off of Yukong's buff as well. After Dan Heng finishes his turn, or finishes his attack, that buff will be gone, but it's fine, because arguably your 2 best units to have the buff on besides Yukong are the ones that have the buff, right? And then Dan Heng's going to buff himself off of his own abilities that he has within his kit, which is good because Yukong's buff works off of crit damage, so does Dan Heng's buffs also work off of crit damage. Now you've used your turn several times. Depending on how much energy regeneration rate, Dan Heng might actually have his ultimate available now. If not, you go to the next turn. Natasha goes. Maybe she has to heal. Maybe she doesn't. Let's just say she heals. Yukong maybe uses her basic. Ting Yun, I believe she either might have to use her buff now, or she actually just uses a basic attack. Dan Heng gets his ultimate, right? And then he uses several stacks from his ultimate. He gets the buffs again from these two that had just buffed him previously, and he gets to use his enhanced basic attack again. So that's just how Dan Heng would function based off of trying to be skill point efficient. That's the best way to play him in my personal opinion, so that you can maximize how many enhanced basic attacks he's able to use, is build them all for speed. And by the way, because they're all built really fast, in that first rotation, they would have all four gone twice before the actual full rotation ended. And then on the second turn, they would only go one time. But because you built them for speed, by the time turn 2 actually ends, they've had 3 turns rather than just 2, which is pretty powerful. Dan Heng more than likely builds his ultimate if you have him built properly for energy regeneration rate and things like that, especially if you have his light cone, his signature light cone. And if you have him at E2, when he uses his ultimate just one time, he'll actually gain all the stacks he needs. But as long as you're staying skill point efficient, Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae might end up being the best DPS character in the entire game. Okay? He's well worth the patience, he's well worth the investment, so I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea here. I'm gonna probably make like somewhat of a clickbaity sort of title so that people understand that Dan Heng is not perfect, right? And Dan Heng requires a little bit of awareness. But I need to point out that in some of my previous videos, people literally freaked out, acting like I'm spreading propaganda about Dan Heng not being good or something, or that he requires high investment, and so people aren't going to pull for him. And that's just ridiculous to even think. I'm warning people that you want to be skill point efficient with Dan so that you can play him properly, while at the same time mentioning that he's potentially going to be the best DPS best DPS character in the game. But you just need to be aware that he's going to be a little bit of a finicky DPS, but he's well worth the investment. Most DPS characters are like this in games like this. There's a little bit of a caveat to the character, but if you play them right, they could be the best character in the game. And that's what Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae is going to be. He will require a little bit of awareness and investment, but if you build a team around him, and if you can build him properly, he might actually be the best character in the game when he arrives. His damage multipliers that I've seen showcase that he will be the best DPS character. The only thing holding him back is if you can actually use him properly, and if you can actually get his attacks off properly. A character like Seela doesn't really have that kind of thing holding her back, but her damage multipliers aren't as big as Dan's, so just something to be aware of there. But yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know how you might want to play Dan, some last minute awareness, and to warn you guys to also only pull Dan if you're sure that you want Dan. So don't pull Dan Heng on day 1. Go try him out in the trial. So go try the character out, right? You go over here to the travel log, and you go over to the aptitude showcase, right? And then you can play the character and try them out here for free, no worries. You just get to practice with the character, and you get to play them, and you go through a little bit of a tutorial, and you get to play them in battle against an enemy, and it's really, really chill. You can find out if you actually like the character or not. They tell you how to use the character. You can also go to like Calyx Gold or something like that, right? And you can challenge, you can go do one of the challenges and click a support character through the support system right here and pick out somebody else's character. As you can see, there's a bunch of people that have Kafka. You can add them to your team, and you can play the character and try them out without having to pull them. That way you know for sure if you actually like the way he plays or not. And on day 1, people are going to have to build him a little bit because he requires new material. But by the end of day 1 or 2, people are going to have fully built up Dan Hengs, and you're going to be able to try them out and use them at like relatively full capacity and find out if you actually like them or not. So that's what I recommend. Pull Dan if you're sure you want to pull Dan. He is worth the investment. He's not going to be autoplay friendly, but he's going to be well worth the investment if you're willing to put the time and effort into him. Anyways, I'll catch you guys next time. If this video was helpful to you in any way, shape, or form, please leave a like and subscribe. I'm trying to hit 2,000 subscribers before the end of September. So, I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out. Enjoy your night. And I wish you the best on your 50-50s, pulling for Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae. I hope you pull him, and you pull him early and win your 50-50. Later.